The bitter wind howled across the Montana plains as Rebecca Harrison pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her trembling shoulders. December 1875 was unforgiving in the frontier town of Silver Creek, and the setting sun painted the sky blood red as darkness crept over the horizon. For 3 hours, she had stood beside the lonely dirt road leading into town, her eyes scanning desperately for any sign of movement, her heart growing heavier with each passing minute. The stagecoach that should have carried her to Calico, California, had departed without her, leaving Rebecca stranded with nothing but a small carpet bag and dwindling hope. Her fingers had long since gone numb, and the tears that occasionally escaped her eyes threatened to freeze on her cheeks. Just as she considered admitting defeat and trudging back toward town, she heard the rhythmic pounding of hooves cutting through the silence of the plains. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the fading daylight. Rebecca straightened her posture despite her exhaustion. She wouldn't appear desperate, even though desperation had been her constant companion since leaving St. Louis. The rider approached at an unhurried pace, and as he drew closer, she could make out his broad shoulders beneath a worn duster, a hat pulled low over his eyes. The horse, a magnificent chestnut Mustang, slowed as it neared her position. The rider, a man whose face bore the weathered lines of someone who'd spent years under the harsh western sun, studied her with curious blue eyes. He couldn't have been more than 30, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. "Miss," he said simply, tipping his hat slightly. "Dangerous place to be standing alone as night's coming on." "I've little choice in the matter, sir," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite her shivering. "The stagecoach left without me." The man's gaze traveled down to her simple dress, her carpet bag, and back to her face. "Where you headed?" "Calico, California," she answered. "I have a teaching position waiting." A hint of a smile touched the corner of his mouth as he shifted in his saddle. "That's quite a ways from here." "I'm well aware," Rebecca said, unable to keep a note of frustration from her voice. The man studied her for another moment before saying something that changed the course of Rebecca's life forever. "You've been waiting for me." Rebecca blinked in confusion. "I beg your pardon. Not exactly for me personally," he clarified, a genuine smile now warming his features. "But for someone heading west. I'm bound for Calico myself, cattle business." He extended a gloved hand down toward her. "Vincent Preston. Most folks just call me Vince." "Rebecca Harrison," she replied, hesitating before taking his offered hand. "I couldn't possibly impose Miss Harrison," Vince interrupted gently. "Night's falling, temperatures dropping, and there won't be another stage for 3 days. I've got supplies, a warm bedroll, and I know safe places to camp. You can ride double with me to the next town, where we can sort out proper transportation for you." Rebecca weighed her options quickly. Stay and likely freeze, or trust this stranger who seemed heaven-sent. "Mr. Preston, I accept your assistance with gratitude," she finally said, reaching for her carpet bag. Vince dismounted in one fluid motion, took the bag from her hands and secured it to his saddle. "Call me Vince," he said, offering her a boost up. "Mr. Preston was my father, and he was a much more respectable man than I'll ever be." As Rebecca settled into the saddle in front of him, the warmth of his body against her back provided immediate relief from the biting cold. His arms reached around her to take the reins, creating a protective circle that made her feel safer than she had in months. "Thank you," she whispered, her words nearly lost in the wind. "Don't thank me yet, Miss Harrison," Vince replied, his breath warm against her ear as he urged the horse forward. "We've got a long journey ahead." As they rode away from her waiting place by the road, Rebecca couldn't help but wonder if this encounter was mere chance, or something arranged by a higher power. Either way, as feeling slowly returned to her frozen fingers and the steady heartbeat of the man behind her kept time with the horse's hooves, she found herself grateful for the first time since leaving home. The darkness settled fully around them as Vince guided his horse away from the main road and toward what appeared to be nothing but empty prairie. Rebecca remained silent, too cold and tired to question his direction. After nearly an hour of riding, a small cluster of trees appeared, offering shelter from the relentless wind. "We'll stop here for the night," Vince announced, bringing his horse to a halt. "It's protected enough to build a small fire without attracting unwanted attention." Rebecca's legs were stiff and sore as he helped her dismount. She stumbled slightly, and his strong hand steadied her by the shoulders. "First time riding?" he asked, no judgment in his voice. "First time riding for so long," she admitted. "And certainly the first time riding with a stranger." Vince smiled briefly before turning to tend to his horse. "Well, I'm honored to be your first stranger, Miss Harrison." Despite her exhaustion, she felt a blush warm her cheeks at his words. She watched as he efficiently unpacked his saddlebags, retrieving a small cooking pot, coffee, and some dried meat. "Can I help?" she offered, feeling useless as he gathered kindling. "You can arrange these rocks in a circle for the fire," he suggested, pointing to several medium-sized stones nearby. "And please call me Rebecca," she added, kneeling to begin the task. Within 30 minutes, a small fire was crackling, and the smell of coffee and beans cooking filled their little camp. Vince had spread his bedroll near the fire and insisted Rebecca take it while he would make do with his saddle and blanket. "So," he said, handing her a tin cup of hot coffee, "what brings a proper lady like yourself all the way out to Calico? That's mining country, rough and unforgiving." Rebecca wrapped her cold fingers around the cup, savoring its warmth. "I answered an advertisement for a schoolteacher. The town is growing and they need someone to educate the children." Vince nodded thoughtfully. "That's true enough. Last time I passed through, they were putting up new buildings every week. Found some real silver there a few years back." "And you?" Rebecca asked. "You mentioned cattle business." "I deliver cattle to growing settlements," he explained. "Buy from ranches in Montana and Wyoming, drive them to where they're needed, make my profit. Been doing it for about 7 years now. You must have seen a great deal of this country." "More than most," he agreed. "Some beautiful, some terrible. But it's a life of my choosing, which is more than many can claim." As they ate their simple meal, Rebecca found herself relaxing in his presence. There was something steady about Vincent Preston, something reliable that put her at ease despite the impropriety of their situation. "Where are you from originally?" he asked, refilling her coffee cup. "St. Louis," she replied. "My father was a bookkeeper for a shipping company. After he and my mother passed last winter, there was little keeping me there." The words came out more easily than she expected. Perhaps it was the darkness, or the strange intimacy of sharing a campfire with this man she'd just met. "I'm sorry for your loss," Vince said quietly. "Thank you," she whispered. "It's been a difficult year." Vince nodded, his eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "Life out here has a way of being both harder and simpler at once. The land doesn't care about your past or your pain. It just demands your respect and your effort." "Is that why you chose this life?" she asked. For its simplicity, a shadow passed over his features. "Partly," he admitted, "and partly because I wasn't fit for much else after the war." "You fought in the war between the states, Union cavalry," he confirmed. "Came west afterward like many others. Some running from memories, some looking for a fresh start." He poked at the fire with a stick. "I suppose I was doing both. The personal revelation hung in the air between them, creating an unexpected connection. Rebecca found herself studying his profile in the firelight, noticing the small scar near his right temple, the way his eyes seemed to hold stories he rarely shared. "You should get some sleep," Vince said, breaking the moment. "We'll head out at first light. Should reach Bridgeport by tomorrow afternoon. They've got a regular stage there that can take you on to Cheyenne, then connect to the western route." Rebecca nodded, suddenly aware of her bone-deep exhaustion. "What about you?" "I'll keep watch for a while," he said. "Old habits." As she settled into his bedroll, surrounded by the unfamiliar scent of leather, tobacco, and something uniquely him, Rebecca found herself thinking that perhaps losing the stagecoach hadn't been such misfortune after all. "Good night, Vince," she said softly. "Good night, Rebecca," he replied, his deep voice the last thing she heard before exhaustion claimed her. Dawn broke with crisp clarity, the eastern sky painted in shades of pink and gold. Rebecca woke to find Vince already up, tending to his horse and preparing a simple breakfast of hardtack and jerky. She felt embarrassed at having slept so soundly while he'd clearly had a much less comfortable night. "You should have woken me," she said, quickly finger-combing her hair and straightening her rumpled dress. "I didn't mean to take advantage of your kindness." Vince glanced up from his task, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "You needed the rest more than I did. Besides, I'm used to short nights and long days." As they ate and prepared to leave, Rebecca noticed Vince frequently scanning the horizon, his expression guarded. "Are you expecting company?" she finally asked. He hesitated before answering. "Just being cautious. These parts can be unpredictable. Renegade Indians sometimes, though most are on reservations now. Bandits are the bigger concern." Rebecca felt a flutter of fear. "Is that common?" "Common enough to stay alert," he replied, helping her onto his horse before mounting behind her. "But don't worry. Most trouble can be avoided if you know what to look for." They rode steadily throughout the morning, the landscape gradually changing from flat plains to rolling hills dotted with scrubby pine trees. Vince pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his travels, his deep voice rumbling against her back as they rode. Rebecca found herself laughing at his tales of frontier mishaps and the characters he'd encountered over the years. By midday, they stopped near a small creek to rest the horse and stretch their legs. Rebecca winced as she dismounted, her muscles protesting the unaccustomed activity. "You'll be saddle sore for a few days," Vince observed sympathetically. "Walking will help, though it doesn't feel like it at first." Rebecca took a few experimental steps, grimacing. "I believe I prefer the discomfort of a stagecoach now." Vince laughed, a rich sound that surprised her with its warmth. "At least on horseback, you get to enjoy the view without being jostled around with 6 other passengers and their questionable hygiene." She smiled despite her discomfort. "There is that advantage." As Vince knelt by the creek to refill their canteens, Rebecca took the opportunity to study him more carefully in daylight. His dark hair curled slightly where it met his collar, and his hands moved with practical efficiency. There was nothing particularly refined about him, yet she found something undeniably appealing in his straightforward manner. "We should reach Bridgeport by nightfall," he said, interrupting her thoughts. "The stage runs every Tuesday and Friday. Today's Monday, so you'd only have to wait 1 day." "And you?" Rebecca asked. "Will you continue on to Calico directly?" Vince shook his head. "I need to meet my business partner in Cheyenne. We'll organize the cattle drive from there. I'll likely be a few weeks behind you arriving in Calico." Rebecca felt an unexpected disappointment at the thought of their paths diverging so soon. "I see. Well, I'm immensely grateful for your assistance. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Someone else would have helped you, he said with certainty. People look out for each other out here. They have to. Is that what you're doing, looking out for me because you have to? The question slipped out before she could reconsider it. Vince stood, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. No, Rebecca. I'm helping you because I wanted to from the moment I saw you standing alone in the cold. The simple honesty of his answer left her momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a response, Vince's attention snapped to something beyond her shoulder, his expression instantly alert. Don't turn around, he said quietly, casually moving toward his horse. But we have company. Rebecca froze, her heart suddenly pounding. Bandits? Not sure yet, he murmured, reaching for something in his saddlebag. Could just be travelers. Either way, stay close to me. She heard it then, the sound of approaching horses, at least 3 or 4 by her estimation. Vince calmly checked his revolver before replacing it in his holster, his movements unhurried but purposeful. Remember, he said softly, most confrontations out here end without violence if everybody stays calm and reasonable. 4 riders appeared around the bend of the creek, rough-looking men with trail-worn clothes and watchful eyes. The leader, a bearded man with a faded red bandana around his neck, raised his hand in greeting but didn't dismount. Afternoon, he called out. Fine day for traveling. Vince nodded, positioning himself slightly in front of Rebecca. That it is. You gentlemen headed somewhere in particular? The leader's eyes flicked from Vince to Rebecca and back again. Cheyenne. Been driving cattle up from Texas. He gestured to his companions. Taking a bit of a break before heading back south. Rebecca could feel the tension in Vince's posture despite his relaxed appearance. Something about these men didn't sit right with him, which meant it didn't sit right with her either. We're bound for Bridgeport, Vince said casually. Just stopping to water the horse. One of the other riders, a thin man with a pockmarked face, leaned forward in his saddle. Ain't often you see a lady out this way. His voice had an unpleasant edge that made Rebecca's skin crawl. My wife and I are visiting her sister, Vince replied smoothly, the lie slipping easily from his lips. She's married to the blacksmith in Bridgeport. The leader studied them for a moment longer before nodding slowly. Well, we won't keep you from your family visit. Creek's big enough for all our horses. The men dismounted on the opposite bank, leading their horses to water. Rebecca could feel their occasional glances, but they maintained their distance. Vince quietly suggested they eat their midday meal quickly and continue on their journey. Were they really cattle drivers? Rebecca whispered as they prepared to leave. Vince's expression was grim as he helped her mount. No cattle driver I know would have hands that clean or boots that new, he said quietly, and they were too interested in us for my comfort. Then who were they? She pressed. The kind of men who make their living off others' misfortune, he replied, swinging up behind her. Let's put some distance between us. They rode hard for the next few hours, Vince frequently checking behind them. By late afternoon, he seemed satisfied they weren't being followed and slowed their pace to rest the horse. I'm sorry about claiming you as my wife, he said eventually. It seemed the safest option in the moment. Rebecca felt a flush creep up her neck. Under the circumstances, I appreciate your quick thinking. I suspect they might have had different intentions had they known I was traveling alone. Vince's jaw tightened. That's exactly what I was thinking. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the outskirts of Bridgeport came into view, a collection of wooden buildings straddling a wide road, smoke rising from several chimneys. Rebecca felt both relief at reaching civilization and a strange reluctance, knowing that her time with Vince would soon end. The Bridgeport Inn has clean rooms, Vince said as they approached the town. The owner's wife, Mrs. Miller, is a good woman. She'll look after you until the stage comes." "You won't be staying?" Rebecca asked, unable to hide her disappointment. "I have business with the local rancher," he explained. "I'll be camping at his property tonight, then heading out early tomorrow." They rode down Bridgeport's main street as the last light of day faded. The town was small but prosperous-looking, with a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and the two-story wooden inn at the far end. A few townspeople glanced curiously at them as they passed. Vince helped Rebecca dismount in front of the inn, her carpetbag in hand. Standing on the boardwalk, she suddenly felt at a loss for words. "I don't know how to thank you properly," she finally said. "You quite literally saved my life." Vince shook his head. "You would have managed somehow. You strike me as a resourceful woman, Rebecca Harrison." She smiled up at him. "Nevertheless, I'm grateful our paths crossed. Will you? That is, when you reach Calico, would you call on me? I'd like to repay your kindness with a proper meal at least." Something warm flickered in his eyes. "I'd like that very much." For a moment they stood in silence, neither quite ready to say goodbye. Then Vince reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded knife. "Take this," he said, pressing it into her hand. "Keep it with you just in case. The journey to Calico isn't without its challenges." Rebecca accepted the gift, touched by his concern. "I will, and I'll see you in Calico, you will," he promised. "It might be a month or so, but I'll find you." With that, he tipped his hat, remounted his horse, and rode away, leaving Rebecca standing before the inn with a strange mixture of gratitude and longing swirling in her chest. The Bridgeport Inn was as clean and respectable as Vince had promised. Mrs. Miller, a plump woman with kind eyes and practical hands, took one look at Rebecca's travel-worn appearance and immediately ordered a hot bath prepared in her room. "You poor dear," she clucked, showing Rebecca to a small but comfortable room on the second floor. "Coming all this way with just that cowboy for company. Dangerous business traveling these days." "Mr. Preston was a perfect gentleman," Rebecca assured her, setting her carpetbag on the bed. Mrs. Miller raised an eyebrow. "Preston? Vincent Preston?" When Rebecca nodded, the innkeeper's expression softened considerably. "Well, that's different then. Vince is good people, passes through a few times a year with his cattle business, always pays his bills and never causes trouble like some cowboys. You know him well?" Rebecca couldn't help asking. "Well enough to know he doesn't usually escort young ladies across the territory," Mrs. Miller replied with a knowing smile. "He must have taken a shine to you." Rebecca felt her cheeks warm. "He was merely being kind. I was stranded when the stagecoach left without me." Mrs. Miller hummed, clearly unconvinced. "Well, the bath will be up shortly. Dinner's served at 6 in the dining room downstairs. The stage to Cheyenne leaves tomorrow at noon. I'll have my boy secure you a ticket first thing in the morning." After the innkeeper left, Rebecca sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past day and a half. The encounter with the suspicious men by the creek, the long hours of riding pressed against Vince's solid warmth, the strange intimacy that had developed between them in such a short time, it all seemed somehow dreamlike now. She drew out the small knife he had given her, running her fingers over the smooth wooden handle. It was a practical gift, not sentimental, yet it represented his concern for her safety. Rebecca carefully tucked it into her boot as she had seen him do with his own, determined to honor his advice. The promised bath was heavenly, washing away the dust and aches of the journey. At dinner, she met several other travelers waiting for tomorrow's stage, a middle-aged couple returning to their ranch near Cheyenne, a traveling salesman with an endless supply of stories, and a young man headed west to seek his fortune in the gold fields. "I hear Calico's the place to be now," the young man enthused when Rebecca mentioned her destination. "Silver's bringing people in by the hundreds. They say it'll be the next Virginia City." "I hope not entirely," Rebecca replied. "I'm to teach the children there. I prefer they not all be raised in mining camps." The salesman laughed. "A school teacher? Well, they're trying to civilize the place then. Good luck to you, miss. Those mining towns need all the civilizing influence they can get." Later, lying in her bed listening to the distant sounds of the saloon down the street, Rebecca found her thoughts returning to Vince. Had he reached the ranch safely? Would he truly seek her out in Calico? And why did the thought of seeing him again cause such a flutter in her chest? She drifted off to sleep with the memory of his voice in her ear, telling her stories as they rode across the open country. The stagecoach journey proved to be as uncomfortable as Vince had predicted. Crammed into a swaying coach with 5 other passengers, Rebecca endured 2 days of dusty travel to reach Cheyenne, the Wyoming territorial capital, and an important junction for travelers heading west. Cheyenne was larger and more established than she had expected, with substantial brick buildings, hotels, and even a proper theater. The influx of railroad money had transformed what had once been a rough tent city into something approaching civilization. Rebecca secured a room at the Cheyenne House Hotel, where she was informed the stage to points west would depart in 3 days. On her second evening in Cheyenne, as she dined alone in the hotel restaurant, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. For a moment, Rebecca thought her mind was playing tricks on her, but no, it was undeniably Vince scanning the room with those observant blue eyes. When his gaze landed on her, a smile broke across his features. "Rebecca," he said, approaching her table, "I hoped I might find you here." "Vince!" she exclaimed, unable to hide her delight. "I thought you had business with your partner." "I do," he confirmed, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "May I join you, please?" she said, suddenly conscious of her heartbeat quickening. He settled into the chair, removing his hat and placing it beside him. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance. His hair was freshly trimmed, his face clean-shaven, and his clothes, while still practical, were notably cleaner than when she'd last seen him. "My partner Jack is meeting me here tomorrow," he explained. "I rode ahead, hoping to catch you before you continued west." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "I couldn't stop thinking about those men we encountered by the creek. I wanted to make sure you reached Cheyenne safely." The admission warmed her more than it probably should have. "That's very considerate of you," she said. "The journey was uneventful if uncomfortable." "And when do you depart for points west?" he asked, ordering coffee when the waiter approached. "The day after tomorrow," Rebecca replied. "Apparently, the route has been delayed due to bridge repairs." Vince nodded thoughtfully. "The spring runoff can be hard on the crossings." A slightly awkward silence fell between them, the easy camaraderie of their journey together temporarily replaced by the formality of the hotel setting. "I'm glad you found me," Rebecca finally said, meeting his eyes directly. "It gives me the chance to thank you properly for your assistance." "No thanks necessary," he insisted, "but I won't pretend I'm not pleased to see you again." The simple honesty of his words dissolved the awkwardness. They fell into comfortable conversation, with Rebecca sharing her impressions of Cheyenne and Vince explaining more about his cattle business. He had a partnership with a rancher named Jack Thornton, who had connections with cattle operations in Texas. They purchased herds at competitive prices and drove them to growing settlements where beef commanded premium prices. "It's not as romantic as the long drives you might have heard about," Vince admitted, "but it's steady work and I enjoy the traveling. Don't you ever wish for a home base?" Rebecca asked. "Somewhere to return to between journeys," a shadow crossed his features. "I did once, Had a small place outside of Denver, but after Sarah died, I couldn't bear to stay." "Sarah?" Rebecca asked gently. "My wife," Vince said quietly. "She passed 5 years ago. Fever took her while I was away on a drive." His fingers tightened around his coffee cup. "By the time I returned, she was already buried." "I'm so sorry," Rebecca whispered, instinctively reaching across to touch his hand. He looked down at their hands, then back to her face. "It was a long time ago, but afterward I sold the place and decided the open road would be my home." After a moment, he turned his hand to briefly squeeze hers. "What about you? No husband waiting back in St. Louis?" Rebecca shook her head. "There was someone once, Thomas Blackwell. We were engaged for nearly a year, but he changed his mind when my parents died and it became clear their estate was burdened with debt." "His loss," Vince said with quiet certainty. They talked until the restaurant emptied around them, sharing stories of their pasts and their hopes for the future. Rebecca described her vision for the school in Calico, while Vince admitted his dream of eventually establishing a horse breeding operation when he tired of the constant travel. "Would you allow me to escort you to dinner tomorrow evening?" Vince asked as they finally prepared to part in the hotel lobby. "There's a decent restaurant just down the street. Not fancy, but the food is good." "I'd like that very much," Rebecca replied, a pleasant warmth spreading through her at the invitation. The following evening found Rebecca taking unusual care with her appearance, pinning her auburn hair in a style that flattered her heart-shaped face, and wearing her best dress, a deep green that brought out the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes. It wasn't vanity, she told herself. It was simply appropriate to look one's best when dining out. Vince waited in the lobby, looking handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a clean white shirt and dark vest. His eyes widened appreciatively when he saw her descending the stairs. "You look beautiful, Rebecca," he said simply, offering his arm. The restaurant was indeed nothing fancy, but the food was excellent and the atmosphere was comfortable. Vince introduced her to his business partner Jack Thornton, a gregarious man with a booming laugh who joined them briefly before tactfully making an excuse to leave them alone. "Jack seems to think I have designs on you," Vince said after his partner departed, a hint of embarrassment coloring his words. "And do you?" Rebecca asked boldly, surprising herself with her directness. Vince studied her face for a long moment. "I find myself thinking about you more than is probably wise," he admitted. "We've known each other barely a week, and you're bound for Calico while I have business that will keep me traveling for at least a month." "Yet here you are," she observed. "Here I am," he agreed with a slight smile. "Riding extra hours to reach Cheyenne ahead of schedule, just to spend one more evening in your company." The candid admission sent a thrill through her. "I'm glad you did." After dinner, they walked slowly through Cheyenne's streets, the spring evening mild enough to be pleasant. They stopped before the territorial courthouse, its impressive facade illuminated by street lamps. "This town was nothing but tents and saloons 5 years ago," Vince remarked. "Now look at it. The railroad changes everything it touches." "Is that what will happen to Calico?" Rebecca asked. "Will it grow this quickly? If the silver holds out, yes. But mining towns are different. They boom and bust with the ore. One day the mines are producing fortunes, the next they're played out and everyone moves on to the next strike." Rebecca frowned. "That's hardly conducive to building a proper community or establishing a school." "True enough," Vince agreed. "But Calico's looking promising so far. The veins are deep and they're finding new ones regularly. It could last decades." He glanced at her. "Does that worry you, the impermanence of it?" She considered the question carefully. "I suppose I've come to realize that nothing is truly permanent. My parents' death taught me that." Perhaps there's something liberating about embracing the temporary nature of things, giving your best to the present moment without too much worry about the distant future. Vince's expression softened as he studied her face in the lamplight. That's a wise perspective for someone so young. I'm 23, she informed him with a smile. Hardly a child. And I'm 31, he replied, old enough to know that wisdom isn't always connected to years. They continued walking, their conversation flowing easily between serious topics and lighter ones. As they approached the hotel once more, Rebecca felt a growing reluctance to end the evening. "When do you leave?" she asked as they paused outside the entrance. "The day after tomorrow," he answered. "Jack and I need to finalize arrangements with the cattle broker, then head north to inspect the herd before purchase." Rebecca nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Then we both leave on the same day in different directions." "It seems so," Vince agreed quietly. "Though I meant what I said about finding you in Calico." "I'll hold you to that promise, Mr. Preston," she said, attempting a lightness she didn't entirely feel. Vince took her hand then, his touch gentle yet somehow electric. "May I call on you again tomorrow evening, before we both depart?" "Please do," she replied softly for a moment. It seemed he might say something more or perhaps even kiss her hand, but instead he simply gave it a gentle squeeze before releasing it. "Good night, Rebecca." "Good night, Vince," she replied, watching as he turned and walked away into the darkness. The following evening passed too quickly, filled with conversation that ranged from childhood memories to books they had read to their favorite seasons. By the time they parted in the hotel lobby for the second night, Rebecca knew with certainty that her feelings for Vincent Preston had grown far beyond simple gratitude or friendly affection. "I'll find you in Calico," he promised again, his eyes holding hers. "Give me 6 weeks, 8 at most." "I'll be waiting," she replied, her voice steadier than her heart. This time he did raise her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles that sent warmth cascading through her. "Safe travels, Rebecca Harrison." "And to you, Vince Preston," she whispered, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. As she watched him walk away for the second time in as many nights, Rebecca wondered if this strange, powerful connection between them was something real and lasting, or merely the product of unusual circumstances and shared adventures. Either way, she knew that Calico now held a promise beyond her teaching position, the promise of seeing him again. The journey to Calico proved longer and more arduous than Rebecca had anticipated. The stagecoach route took her south through Denver, then west into Utah Territory, before turning southwest toward Nevada and finally into California. Each leg of the journey brought new landscapes and challenges, from mountain passes still thick with spring snow to desert stretches where the heat seemed to shimmer invisible waves above the sand. By the time the stagecoach rolled into Calico nearly 3 weeks later, Rebecca was exhausted, dusty, and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake in coming so far from everything familiar. Calico itself did little to reassure her at first glance. Nestled in the barren Calico Mountains of San Bernardino County, the town had sprung up practically overnight following the Silver Strike of 1881. Main Street was a haphazard collection of wooden structures, canvas tents, and a few more substantial buildings constructed of the reddish stone that gave the mountains their name. The air hung heavy with dust, and the constant clang of mining operations echoed from the surrounding hills. The stagecoach deposited her outside the Silver Dollar Hotel, which, despite its grand name, was merely a 2-story wooden structure with peeling paint. A young boy promptly appeared to carry her bag. "You the new teacher, miss?" he asked, eyeing her curiously. "I am," Rebecca confirmed, straightening her travel-worn dress as best she could. Rebecca Harrison. I'm Tommy Wilson, the boy replied. My pa's on the town council. He said to watch for you and bring you straight to Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house. She's expecting you. Mrs. Sullivan proved to be a stern-faced widow in her 50s who ran the only respectable boarding house in Calico. The building was simple but scrupulously clean, with 4 bedrooms upstairs that she rented exclusively to ladies of quality, as she put it. The school term doesn't start for another 2 weeks, Mrs. Sullivan informed Rebecca as she showed her to a small but pleasant room at the rear of the house. That'll give you time to settle in and meet some of the families. Sunday service is tomorrow. Best place to introduce yourself to the community. The following weeks passed in a blur of introductions and preparations. The schoolhouse was a single-room building at the edge of town, recently constructed but still needing considerable work before classes could begin. Rebecca threw herself into the task, grateful for the distraction from her thoughts of Vince, and when or if he would appear in Calico as promised. The town itself was a curious mix of rough frontier elements and attempts at civilization. While saloons and brothels dominated one end of Main Street, the other boasted a proper general store, a milliner's shop, and even a small lending library maintained by the preacher's wife. The mining companies had invested in infrastructure, bringing in materials for proper buildings, and even laying wooden sidewalks along the main thoroughfare to combat the omnipresent dust. The people of Calico welcomed Rebecca with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The families with children were generally pleased to have a proper teacher, while some of the single miners and businessmen viewed her as a potential marriage prospect. Situation Mrs. Sullivan warned her about directly. A respectable young woman is a rare commodity in these parts, the landlady cautioned over breakfast one morning. You'll need to establish clear boundaries, especially with Mr. Hargrove. Elias Hargrove was the owner of the largest general store in Calico and a member of the town council. A widower in his early 40s, he had made his interest in Rebecca known almost immediately, appearing at Mrs. Sullivan's with flowers and invitations to dinner that Rebecca politely but firmly declined. I'm focused on establishing the school, she explained to Mrs. Sullivan. Romance is the furthest thing from my mind at present. That wasn't entirely true, of course. Though she kept busy from dawn until dusk, her thoughts often drifted to Vince in quiet moments. Had he completed his cattle business successfully? Was he on his way to Calico now, or had circumstances changed his plans? The uncertainty was maddening. 4 weeks after her arrival in Calico, as Rebecca was arranging desks in the schoolhouse with the help of several older students, a commotion outside drew their attention. A small crowd had gathered in the street, watching as a sizable herd of cattle was driven through town, headed for the corrals at the southern edge. That'll be the new beef for Miller's butcher shop, one of the boys explained excitedly. Pa said we'd be getting fresh meat this week. Rebecca's heart leapt at the news. Cattle meant cattle drivers and just possibly. She excused herself and walked to the doorway, shading her eyes against the bright California sun as she searched the dusty chaos for a familiar figure. The cattle passed in a cloud of dust and noise, followed by half a dozen mounted men. Rebecca's spirits fell as she scanned their faces and found no sign of Vince among them. Expecting someone, Miss Harrison. Mrs. Sullivan appeared beside her, a knowing expression on her lined face. Just curious about the commotion, Rebecca replied, forcing a smile. That evening, as she sat on Mrs. Sullivan's front porch enjoying a rare moment of relaxation, Rebecca tried to reconcile herself to the possibility that Vince might not come. Perhaps his business had taken him in a different direction, Or maybe the connection she had felt between them had been one-sided. 6 weeks had nearly passed since their parting in Cheyenne, with 2 more to go before his promised 8 weeks at most. "Miss Harrison," a deep voice called from the street, interrupting her thoughts. Rebecca looked up, her breath catching as she recognized the figure approaching the porch steps, leading a tired-looking chestnut horse. Vincent Preston stood before her, trail worn and dusty but unmistakably real. "You're here," she said, rising from her chair, unable to keep the joy from her voice. "I promised I would be," he replied simply, removing his hat. "I apologize for my appearance. We just brought the herd in and I came straight here before even finding accommodations." "You brought the cattle through town today?" Rebecca asked in confusion, "but I watched them pass and didn't see you." A smile tugged at his lips. "I was behind the herd dealing with a few stragglers. By the time I got through town, you must have gone back inside." They stood looking at each other, the weeks of separation creating a momentary awkwardness that hadn't existed before. Rebecca was acutely aware of Mrs. Sullivan watching curiously through the window, and several passers-by slowing to observe the interaction. "You must be exhausted," Rebecca finally said. "Have you eaten?" "Not since breakfast," Vince admitted. "But I don't want to impose." "Nonsense," she interrupted. "Mrs. Sullivan always prepares more food than we can eat. I'm sure she wouldn't mind setting another place." As if on cue, the front door opened and Mrs. Sullivan appeared. "Mr. Preston, is it?" she asked, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of his appearance. "Rebecca has mentioned you. Come in and wash up. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. "My horse," Vince began. "Tommy, Mrs. Sullivan called to a boy passing on the street. "Take Mr. Preston's horse to the livery and tell Mr. Jensen to put it on my account." She turned back to Vince. "The washroom is through the kitchen. I'll find you a clean towel." With that, she disappeared inside, leaving Vince looking somewhat bemused. "She's rather formidable," Rebecca explained with a smile, "but kind-hearted underneath the stern exterior." "Reminds me of my sergeant during the war," Vince replied with a chuckle. He hesitated, then added more softly, "It's good to see you, Rebecca. Better than I can properly express." "I'm glad you kept your promise," she said simply. "I was beginning to wonder. I would have been here sooner, but we had trouble with the herd in Utah. Lost nearly a week dealing with diseased cattle." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Not a day passed that I didn't think of you." The admission sent warmth spreading through her chest. "Come inside," she said, suddenly shy. "We can talk more after you've rested and eaten." Dinner was a slightly awkward affair, with Mrs. Sullivan subtly interrogating Vince about his background, business, and intentions, while 2 other boarders, a young woman who worked at the millinery and an older lady who played the organ at church, watched with undisguised curiosity. Vince handled the questioning with good grace, his responses thoughtful and honest. Yes, he had fought for the Union during the war. No, he didn't consider cattle driving his permanent occupation. He was saving to establish a horse breeding operation. Yes, he had known Rebecca since Montana Territory, when he'd helped her after a stagecoach mishap. "And now you've come to Calico specifically to see Miss Harrison again?" Mrs. Sullivan asked pointedly, serving apple pie for dessert. Rebecca felt her cheeks flush, but Vince answered without hesitation. "Yes, madam. That was a significant factor in my decision to bring cattle to this particular market." "At least you're honest about it," Mrs. Sullivan replied with a sniff that didn't quite hide her approval. "More than I can say for some who come calling with their motives hidden behind fancy words." After dinner, with Mrs. Sullivan's grudging permission, Rebecca and Vince sat on the front porch in the gathering twilight. The town was settling down for the evening, though raucous piano music and occasional shouts could be heard from the saloons at the far end of Main Street. "Your landlady is protective," Vince observed, settling into a chair beside Rebecca. "She takes her responsibility for her ladies of quality very seriously," Rebecca agreed with a smile. "Though I think you passed her initial inspection." "High praise indeed," he chuckled. "And how are you finding Calico? Is it what you expected?" Rebecca considered the question. "It's rougher than I anticipated, but not without promise. The schoolhouse is nearly ready, and I have 27 students enrolled so far. Some of the children have never attended school before." "They're fortunate to have you," Vince said, his eyes warm as he looked at her. "You seem content here." "I'm finding my place," she acknowledged. "And you, how long will you stay in Calico?" "That depends," he said carefully. "Jack has taken the payment for the cattle and headed back to Wyoming. I told him I had reasons to remain here for a while." "What reasons might those be?" Rebecca asked, her heart quickening. Vince turned to face her fully, the porch swing creaking slightly with his movement. "I think you know, Rebecca. These past weeks apart only confirmed what I began to suspect in Cheyenne, that what I feel for you is something rare and worth pursuing." He paused, searching her face. "If you feel anything similar, that is." Rebecca took a steadying breath. "I do," she admitted, "though it seems impossible that such feelings could develop so quickly." "Does it?" Vince asked softly. "Out here, people learn to recognize what's genuine, be it a gold claim, a true friend, or something more. Life is too uncertain to waste time questioning what your heart knows to be true." From inside, Mrs. Sullivan loudly cleared her throat, reminding them of propriety's limits. Vince smiled ruefully. "I should find lodgings for the night," he said, rising. "Would you permit me to call on you properly tomorrow? Perhaps show me this schoolhouse you've been preparing?" "I'd like that very much," Rebecca replied, standing as well. Vince took her hand, his touch sending that now familiar warmth through her. "Until tomorrow, then," he said, brushing his lips across her knuckles before releasing her hand and stepping back. "Until tomorrow," she echoed, watching as he descended the porch steps and walked down the darkening street. As promised, Vince appeared at Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house the following morning, freshly shaven and wearing clean clothes. He had secured a room at the Silver Dollar Hotel and, as Rebecca soon learned, had already begun making inquiries about business opportunities in the area. "The livery stable is for sale," he mentioned as they walked toward the schoolhouse. "The owner's wife is ill, and they're returning east. It might be a good starting point for eventually breeding horses." "You're considering settling in Calico?" Rebecca asked, trying to keep the hope from her voice. "I'm considering several things," Vince replied, glancing at her with a smile. "The livery stable being just one of them." The next few weeks established a pattern that quickly became the talk of Calico. Vince called on Rebecca daily, escorting her to the schoolhouse, helping with preparations, and often joining her for dinner at Mrs. Sullivan's. On Sundays, they attended church together, their paired appearance raising eyebrows and inspiring gossip among the townspeople. Elias Hargrove observed these developments with obvious displeasure, his previously friendly demeanor toward Rebecca cooling considerably. When they encountered him on the street, his greetings became terse, and he barely acknowledged Vince's presence. "I believe Mr. Hargrove is jealous," Rebecca remarked one afternoon as they walked back from the schoolhouse. "He has good reason to be," Vince replied, his hand warm against the small of her back as he guided her around a muddy patch in the road. "Though I can't fault his taste." Rebecca felt herself blush at the compliment. "Mrs. Sullivan says half the unmarried women in town were setting their caps for you from the moment you arrived with the cattle herd. It seems we're inspiring gossip from all directions." "Let them talk," Vince said easily. Small towns run on gossip like engines run on coal. The school term began in early October, with Rebecca greeting her students in the freshly painted schoolhouse. The children ranged in age from 5 to 16, with widely varying levels of previous education. Some could barely write their names, while others had attended proper schools back east before their families came west. Vince purchased the livery stable, throwing himself into the business with characteristic energy. He hired 2 reliable workers to handle day-to-day operations, while he made trips to nearby settlements looking for quality horses to purchase. His reputation for fair dealing and horse knowledge spread quickly, bringing customers from neighboring mining camps and ranches. On a crisp November evening, as they walked along the edge of town watching the sunset paint the Calico Mountains in shades of orange and gold, Vince took Rebecca's hand and stopped. "I need to tell you something," he said, his expression serious. Rebecca felt a flutter of anxiety. "What is it?" "I've received a letter from Jack. There's a significant opportunity to purchase a large herd in Arizona territory at an excellent price. He wants me to oversee the transaction." "I see," Rebecca said quietly, trying to hide her disappointment. "When would you leave?" "That's just it," Vince continued. "I've been thinking about us a great deal. I've spent years moving from place to place, never putting down roots. But these past months in Calico with you—" He paused, taking both her hands in his. "Rebecca, I don't want to leave. Not without knowing if you might consider a future together." Her heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. "What are you saying, Vince?" "I'm saying that I love you," he replied simply. "I think I've loved you since I found you waiting in the cold beside that Montana road. And if you'll have me, I'd like to build a life here with you." Tears pricked at Rebecca's eyes. "Are you proposing?" "Inelegantly, perhaps," he admitted with a rueful smile. "But yes, Rebecca Harrison, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching. "Yes, I will." Vince's face broke into a radiant smile before he drew her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that seemed to seal a promise made long before either of them had realized it. Their engagement announcement caused exactly the stir one might expect in a small town like Calico. Mrs. Sullivan declared herself, not the least bit surprised, but insisted on a proper wedding with all the trimmings. The town's ladies immediately began planning, while the men slapped Vince on the back and offered congratulations tinged with good-natured envy. Only Elias Hargrove received the news coldly, his congratulations perfunctory at best. Rebecca thought little of it, too caught up in happiness and wedding preparations to concern herself with wounded pride. The wedding was set for Christmas Day, a date that would allow Vince to complete his business arrangements and prepare their future home, a small but sturdy house near the livery stable that he purchased, and began renovating with characteristic thoroughness. 3 weeks before the wedding, as winter settled over Calico with unexpected ferocity, bringing rare snow to the high desert mountains, Vince reluctantly informed Rebecca that he needed to make a brief trip to San Bernardino to finalize a horse purchase. "It's a matched pair of Morgans," he explained. "Exactly what I need to start the breeding program. I should be back within 5 days, a week at most." "I'll miss you," Rebecca said, reaching up to straighten his collar as they stood on Mrs. Sullivan's porch. "But I understand. The sooner you build the business, the better for our future." Vince kissed her goodbye, promising to return as quickly as possible. Rebecca watched him ride away, already counting the days until his return. 4 days passed with no word. On the 5th day, a winter storm swept through, dropping temperatures and coating Calico in ice. On the 6th day, as Rebecca tried to quell her growing anxiety, Elias Hargrove approached her after school. "Miss Harrison," he said, his manner stiffly formal. "I've received troubling news from my business associate in San Bernardino that I feel duty-bound to share with you." Rebecca's heart clenched. "What news?" "It appears that Mr. Preston was indeed in San Bernardino last week, but not for the purchase of horses. He was seen boarding an eastbound train with a substantial amount of luggage." Hargrove's expression was a study in false sympathy. "I regret to inform you that it appears he has departed without intention of return." "I don't believe you," Rebecca said flatly, though fear clawed at her chest. "Vince wouldn't leave without explanation." "I understand your reluctance to accept this information," Hargrove continued smoothly. "However, I assure you my source is reliable. The ticket purchased was for Chicago with no return journey planned." Rebecca turned away, unwilling to let him see the doubt in her eyes. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Hargrove, but I have complete faith in my fiancé. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have papers to grade." Alone in her room that evening, however, Rebecca's certainty wavered. Why hadn't Vince sent word if he'd been delayed? The storm might explain a day or two, but nearly a week of silence was unlike him. And how easily she had believed his promise to stay, when his entire adult life had been spent in constant motion. The next day brought no news, nor the day after that. A full week passed beyond Vince's promised return date, and even Mrs. Sullivan's resolute faith began to falter. "Men are unpredictable creatures, dear," she said gently over breakfast. "Even the best of them." "Not Vince," Rebecca insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. Something must have happened to prevent his return or communication. That afternoon, as Rebecca dismissed her students for the day, she made a decision. Tomorrow she would travel to San Bernardino herself to discover the truth, whatever it might be. She was packing a small valise when a commotion in the street drew her to the window. A rider was approaching at speed, his horse lathered despite the cold. As he drew closer, Rebecca's heart nearly stopped. It was Tommy Wilson, who had taken a job as Vince's stable boy. She rushed downstairs and out onto the porch just as Tommy reined in his mount. "Miss Harrison," he called, breathless. "You gotta come quick. They found Mr. Preston. Found him." "What do you mean? Where is he?" The questions tumbled out as fear gripped her. "About 10 miles south," Tommy explained, his young face grave. "His horse came back to the stable yesterday all spooked, but we couldn't search proper because of the storm. Mr. Jensen organized a search party at first light. They found him in that ravine near Eagle Pass. He's hurt bad, miss. They're bringing him to Doc Simmons now." Rebecca didn't wait to hear more. She grabbed her coat and ran toward the doctor's office at the far end of town, her heart pounding with equal measures of fear and desperate hope. Dr. Simmons' office was a small building attached to his home, with a separate entrance for patients. As Rebecca approached, she saw several men carrying a stretcher through the door. She followed them inside, pushing past curious onlookers until she reached the examination room. Vince lay motionless on the doctor's table, his face pale beneath several days' worth of beard growth. A deep gash ran along his temple, crusted with dried blood, and his right arm was bent at an unnatural angle. "Vince," she whispered, moving to his side and taking his left hand in hers. His eyelids fluttered at her voice, opening to reveal those familiar blue eyes, now clouded with pain. "Rebecca," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, tried to get back." "Don't speak," she urged, tears flowing freely now. "Save your strength, doctor." Simmons, a competent man despite his relative youth, gently moved Rebecca aside. "I need to examine him properly, Miss Harrison. From what the search party described, he's been out there for at least 4 days. It's a miracle he survived the cold." "Will he recover?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Too early to say for certain," the the doctor replied honestly. But he's young and strong. Those are significant advantages. The next hours passed in an agonizing blur as Dr. Simmons set Vince's broken arm, stitched the head wound, and treated him for exposure and dehydration. Rebecca refused to leave, assisting the doctor when needed and sitting vigilantly by Vince's side when there was nothing else to be done. As night fell, with Vince stabilized but unconscious, Dr. Simmons insisted Rebecca get some rest. "You can use the spare room," he offered. "Mrs. Simmons will bring you some dinner. But you need sleep, Miss Harrison. Exhausting yourself won't help Mr. Preston." Reluctantly, Rebecca agreed, though she extracted a promise that the doctor would wake her immediately if Vince's condition changed. In the small adjoining bedroom, as she picked at the stew Mrs. Simmons had kindly provided, Rebecca tried to piece together what might have happened. The search party had found Vince's saddlebags, including documents for the horse purchase he'd mentioned. He hadn't been abandoning her, he'd been trying to return as promised when some accident befell him on the trail. The realization that she had doubted him, even briefly, filled her with shame. How quickly she had allowed Hargrove's insinuations to plant seeds of uncertainty. Around midnight, Rebecca returned to Vince's bedside, relieving Dr. Simmons, who went to grab a few hours' sleep. Vince's breathing was steady now, though occasionally interrupted by small sounds of pain. His forehead was warm to her touch, too warm. "Fight, Vince," she whispered, pressing a cool cloth to his brow. "Fight to come back to me." For 3 days, Vince hovered between consciousness and delirium as fever gripped him. Dr. Simmons feared infection from the head wound or possibly internal injuries they couldn't detect. Rebecca barely left his side, sponging his burning skin with cool water, helping him swallow broth when he was lucid enough, and praying as she had never prayed before. On the 4th morning, she woke from an uncomfortable doze in the chair beside his bed to find his blue eyes clear and focused on her face. "You look terrible," he whispered, a faint smile tugging at his lips. A sob of relief escaped her as she leaned forward to touch his cheek. "You're hardly in a position to critique my appearance, Vincent Preston." His smile widened slightly. "Fair point." He attempted to shift position, wincing as the movement jarred his broken arm. "How long have I been here?" 4 days, Rebecca answered. "What happened, Vince?" "We found your saddlebags with the horse purchase papers, but ambushed," he interrupted, his expression darkening. "On my way back from San Bernardino, 2 men masked. They took my money, but that wasn't what they were after." He paused, gathering strength. "They mentioned Hargrove, said he'd pay well for making sure I didn't make it back to Calico." Rebecca's blood ran cold. "Elias Hargrove, you're certain?" Vince nodded weakly. "They thought they'd finished me when they pushed me into that ravine. I managed to crawl into a sheltered spot, but couldn't climb out with my arm broken. If my horse hadn't found its way back." "Hargrove told me you'd left," Rebecca said quietly, "that you'd been seen boarding a train eastbound with no intention of returning." Anger flashed in Vince's eyes. "He wanted you to believe I'd abandoned you. For a brief, shameful moment, I feared it might be true," Rebecca admitted. "I'm so sorry for doubting you, even fleetingly." Vince's left hand found hers, squeezing weakly. "You have nothing to apologize for." "If our positions were reversed, I might have wondered too." His eyes held hers intently. "But I will never leave you, Rebecca. Not willingly." The days that followed brought steady improvement in Vince's condition. The fever broke, the head wound began to heal cleanly, and Dr. Simmons declared him out of immediate danger, though recovery would be slow. The sheriff investigated Vince's claims about the ambush, but without concrete evidence beyond Vince's testimony, no action could be taken against Hargrove. "He'll show his hand again," Vince predicted grimly when the sheriff delivered this news. Men like that always do. 2 weeks after Vince's rescue, he was strong enough to be moved to their partially renovated house, where Rebecca took up residence as well, propriety be damned. Mrs. Sullivan, after initial protestations, agreed to serve as chaperone, moving into the spare bedroom until the wedding. "We'll simply move the ceremony up," Rebecca decided, "as soon as you're well enough to stand at the altar." "Are you sure?" Vince asked. "I'd imagined giving you the Christmas wedding you deserve, not a hasty ceremony with me barely able to stay upright." Rebecca took his face between her hands. "All I want is to be your wife, Vince Preston. The rest is just details." They were married the following Sunday in Calico's small church, with Vince leaning heavily on a cane but standing proud as Rebecca walked down the aisle to join him. The town turned out in force to witness the union, their collective romantic hearts touched by the couple's journey from that cold Montana roadside to the altar. Elias Hargrove was conspicuously absent from the ceremony. 2 days later, news reached Calico that he had sold his store and departed for parts unknown, evidently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor once rumors of his involvement in Vince's accident began circulating. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came healing and new beginnings. Vince's arm mended, though he would always carry a slight stiffness in the joint. The livery stable prospered under his management, and his first attempts at horse breeding showed promising results. Rebecca continued teaching, finding fulfillment in watching her students' progress, and the school become an integral part of Calico's growing community. In the evenings, they would often sit on the porch of their now completed home, watching the sunset paint the Calico Mountains in the same rich hues that had surrounded them when Vince first proposed. "You ever miss the traveling?" Rebecca asked one such evening, her head resting comfortably against his shoulder. "The freedom of the open road." Vince considered the question, his arm tightening around her. "Sometimes I miss the variety of landscapes, the unexpected discoveries around each bend." He turned to look at her, his eyes warm with contentment. "But I've found something far more valuable than freedom of movement." "And what might that be, Mr. Preston?" she asked with a smile. "A place to belong," he answered simply. "With you." As twilight deepened around them, Rebecca reflected on the strange, winding path that had led them here from a chance encounter on a cold Montana road to this shared life in Calico. How different things might have been had that stagecoach not departed without her, had Vince not happened along at precisely that moment, had she not been standing there, waiting in the cold beside the road when he appeared with those life-changing words. "You've been waiting for me." Perhaps it had been chance, or perhaps something more purposeful, a design beyond their understanding that had brought together two souls meant to find each other despite all odds. "I love you, Vince Preston," she whispered, turning to meet his gaze. "And I love you, Rebecca Preston," he replied, bending to capture her lips in a kiss that held all the warmth of homecoming and all the promise of their future together. The following spring brought new life to their home with the birth of their daughter, Elizabeth. Vince's horse breeding business had expanded to include several prized stallions and a growing reputation throughout Southern California. Rebecca continued teaching until the final weeks before the birth, having trained an assistant to take over temporarily. Calico itself was thriving, the silver mine still producing wealth that supported the town's growth. What had once been a rough mining camp now boasted a proper main street with boardwalks, a small hotel, and even a theater where traveling shows occasionally performed. The school had expanded to 2 rooms, with Rebecca serving as headmistress and teaching the older students while her assistant handled the younger children. On a warm evening in May 1886, As they celebrated their third wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner after putting Elizabeth to bed, Vince presented Rebecca with a small wooden box. "What's this?" she asked, opening it to reveal a delicate silver locket. "Open it," he urged, his expression tender. Inside was a miniature sketch of their family, Vince, Rebecca, and little Elizabeth, expertly rendered by a traveling artist who had passed through Calico the previous month. On the opposite side was an inscription, "From cold roads to warm hearts." Tears filled Rebecca's eyes as she looked up at her husband. "It's beautiful." "Not as beautiful as the reality," Vince replied, helping her fasten the locket around her neck. 3 years ago, I wasn't certain what the future held, only that I wanted you in it. Now." He gestured around their comfortable home, evidence of their shared life together. "Now I can't imagine any other path." Rebecca rose from her chair, moving to sit in his lap as she had done countless times during their marriage. "Do you remember what you told me once? About people out here learning to recognize what's genuine?" Vince nodded, his arms encircling her waist. "I said life is too uncertain to waste time questioning what your heart knows to be true." "Wisest words I ever heard," Rebecca said softly, leaning forward to press her lips to his. "And truer now than ever." Outside their window, Calico continued its evening routines, miners returning from their shifts, shopkeepers closing for the day, children being called home for supper. The town that had once seemed so foreign to Rebecca was now as familiar as her own heartbeat, its rhythms synchronized with her own. In the nursery, Elizabeth made a small sound and both parents paused, listening. When silence returned, they smiled at each other in the shared understanding of parenthood. "I have news," Rebecca said after a moment, a hint of excitement in her voice. "I wasn't certain until today, but now I am." Vince's eyebrows rose questioningly. "Come February, Elizabeth will have a little brother or sister to play with," Rebecca announced, watching joy spread across her husband's features. "Really?" he asked, his hands gently cradling her still flat stomach. "You're certain?" Rebecca nodded, covering his hands with her own. "Dr. Simmons confirmed it this morning. I wanted to save the news for our anniversary." Vince pulled her closer, burying his face against her neck as emotion overtook him. "I never thought I could be this happy," he whispered against her skin. "Never imagined this life was possible for me." "Nor I," Rebecca admitted, running her fingers through his hair. "After my parents died, I thought I was destined for a life of simple duty, teaching other people's children, growing old alone. And instead," she smiled, tilting his face up to meet her eyes, "instead I found you. Or perhaps you found me, standing in the cold beside that road." "Best detour I ever took," Vince said, his voice husky with emotion. "And the journey's only just beginning." As night settled fully over Calico, the silver moon rising above the mountains that had given the town its name and fortune, Rebecca Preston rested in her husband's arms, surrounded by the life they had built together from an unlikely beginning. Whatever the future held, the joys of watching their children grow, the inevitable challenges that life would bring, the continuing evolution of their town and their world, they would face it as they had faced everything since that cold Montana evening. Together, with courage, faith, and an enduring love that had begun with a chance encounter on a lonely road. For Rebecca, who had once waited in the cold with dwindling hope, and for Vince, who had recognized in a stranger the woman who would become his heart's home, that road had been just the beginning of a journey neither could have imagined, one that would continue through all the days of their lives, warmed by the certainty that they had been waiting for each other all along.